everybody. Today we're going to be looking at the literacy and numeracy test for initial teacher education students, or LANTITE, and today we're going to be looking at the literacy section in particular, the first 20 questions. I will write a little bit more about this in the disclaimer or the description for the video, but I just want all students to be aware that some of the answers, they're a little bit subjective. It's not a black and white dynamic like it is in the numeracy section, where you definitely have a right answer that is very clear to see. Even native speakers of English will have some difficulties on some questions. But the aim is not necessarily to get 100%. It's fairly unrealistic. The aim is to just pass the test, become a teacher. So getting 70 or 80% in this test will be more than enough, I'm sure. I've got two windows open because it will just make it a little bit easier for being able to scroll down to look at the certain information. That way we can look at the question as well as the information we need at the same time. So we skip the little tutorial questions that it has at the start, and we'll start on question 1, which is down here, and then on the other one we will move to the information part. So question 1, it says the ultimate intention of using the simulation glasses is to. So we need to find the simulation glasses section, which is just over here. And it's asking what is the main aim, and how it can help is this column here, or what it does. So we'll probably be looking at one of those. How it can help: allow students and staff to gain a better understanding of some experiences of people with vision difficulties, which we can infer that B is the one for that increase staff and student empathy towards student with vision difficulties. Better understanding, so there can be empathy. Empathy obviously alluding to, feeling what they feel, being able to understand what they're going through by going through something similar. So that's the answer for question 1. Question 2. According to the text, what is the main advantage of a sound-filled system over an audio induction loop system? So this is one of the questions that I found a little bit funny, and there are a number of them in the literacy sections. So this is something that you need to get used to. So we're comparing sound-filled compared to audio induction. So here is sound-filled. It can allow students with hearing difficulties to hear a bit more clearly. It improves communication. It reduces background noise. It can be expensive, not suitable in some areas. It benefits all students. Now, if we compare that to the audio induction loop system, it does say that it improves communication, reduces background noise, so fairly similar to the sound field, can be expensive, highly effective in certain areas. Not all areas can be covered. As we can see, none of the answers are an absolute perfect match, as you could infer that improves communication is fairly similar to what is written up here. Now, the answer that they are looking for is that it will help more students, and this is based purely on the fact that it mentions students with hearing difficulties. Again, that would be sort of expected when it's saying it improves communication. But the other thing that makes this a little bit more complicated than it ought to have been would be maybe in the first couple of sections, in the easier to maintain or easier to install, especially the easier to install, which is what my initial answer was, based on the inference that the audio induction loop requires installation, that it makes mention of there, which sounds somewhat complicated compared to the sound-filled system, which doesn't really make any mention of the installation. So this is the tricky aspect of this literacy test, that you need to try to look at the inferences and see which is a greater inference, which is a greater stretch, because it has literally mentioned students with hearing difficulties while the other one did not when it comes to how it assists. That is less of a stretch to declare that is the benefit of the sound field system compared to the audio induction loop, as opposed to the mention of installation, even though one says it requires installation while the other one does not. So this is again a bit of a tricky aspect that you can get sometimes with multiple choice questions, that you have multiple answers that are correct, but one is deemed to be more correct than the others, and sometimes only slightly more so. Question 3. Which of the following pieces of equipment has only advantages listed in the things to consider column? So we can just go through them quickly to see which ones are only beneficial. So if we're looking at sound field system, it can be expensive. Well, that's not positive, so we can jump away from that one already. Next one is interactive whiteboards and visual resources. Pardon me. So it says not all areas of the school can be covered. Oh, sorry, wrong one. Commonly used, that's good. Teacher training. Not all classrooms have them, or some don't work. So that's obviously a bit of a negative. Now, large print keyboard and braille embossers. So now let's look at the vision. Large print keyboards I have missed. So we'll go up a little bit. Large print keyboard, easy to install, relatively cheap, portable. They're all positive, so this looks like the right answer, but we can just confirm by looking at the bottom one there. Braille embossers can be expensive, can be noisy, obviously some negatives there. So the answer is definitely the large print keyboard, only positives. Question 4. Which information is provided in the list at the end of the text? So it's got a list of websites. Sources of further information? It absolutely. Professional development workshop dates? Well, they're not dates, so it certainly can't be that. Information on where to purchase specialist equipment? If it said it above, that's a possibility, but I wouldn't have thought so. You've got to actually look at what is the name of these places. So Australian curriculum, they're definitely not selling you something there. And a list of schools with special facilities, well, it doesn't even mention a school. So you can very easily infer that it is sources of further information on the topic. Question 5. Again, this is one of the trickier questions that there are. Leon will graduate from his teaching course at the end of the year. He feels positive about most curriculum areas, but is less confident about science and has decided to join the Australian Science Teachers Association, which organises conferences and provides advice about curriculum plans and resources. Under which selection criterion should Leon refer to this decision? So, obviously a very wordy sentence, but it's just saying which of these should he refer his decision to. Like, so about him wanting to join a teaching association and he's not completely confident about everything, especially science, you know, what does that fall into? So we can ignore 1 because that's not even an option. So we've got 2, 3, 4 and 5. What is tricky about this question is that there's a lot of information which isn't useful. So what we mainly need to look at is something about joining a further association, because being positive about curriculum areas and things like that, they're mentioning a lot of information that has nothing to do with it. So he understands how students learn and effective classroom strategies. He makes no real mention of this. He just says he's positive about most things. Differentiation, again, it's not really mentioning it. Ability to monitor and assist student learning and use data. Again, it's not directly saying that. High-level written verbal communication skills, high interpersonal, constructive relationships with students. He's able to develop those and work with colleagues and continually improve teaching and learning. Now, given that he's actually trying to do better with his science by joining an organisation, it infers that he is trying to improve his teaching and learning, but everything else here is not mentioned at all. Now, the correct answer is this last one. Demonstrated commitment and capacity to actively contribute to a broad range of school activities and a commitment to ongoing professional reflection and learning to enable further development of skills, expertise and teaching capacity. So it is just based on that last sentence there. that because he has decided to join the Australian Science Teachers Association, that makes mention of his commitment to enhance his abilities as a teacher, to further develop his skills and expertise. The rest of that criterion obviously has nothing to do with what he has said, but that is what we needed to look for, something about a commitment to learning more and further development. Because in teaching circles, something like this could be considered professional development. And hence we've got the word development, we've got the word professional, works perfectly. Again, a bit of an odd one, but the answer is SC5. This is, I guess, mainly a test to see can you sort out the useful information from the useless information. As part of his teaching professional experience placement, Stephen, together with his supervising teacher, conducted evaluations of students' reading skills. Based on these results, Stephen developed reading lists and selected specific literacy activities to carry out with small groups of students. So this has obviously got to do with looking at the information that he's been able to gather from students' abilities. So his activity can be linked to a high level of interpersonal skills. Interpersonal skills is getting along with people. It's not really mentioned much. The ability to use data to inform teaching. This looks to be exactly what we're looking for. A commitment to ongoing professional reflection. That was from the earlier question. And a willingness to contribute to extracurricular school activities. Again, from the earlier question. This hits the nail on the head. Which is obviously an idiom for doing the right thing. So this is inferring that by conducting evaluations, doing tests of how well students can read, he is then able to look at those results. Based on these results, he'll make reading lists and give different activities to different students. He'll put them in small groups. Those that read well, he can give harder texts. Those that have more difficulties will be supported further. So definitely he's looking at data and he's using it to help inform his teaching practices. Something that we'll all have to do when we're teachers. Okay, so we now have a lot of tables to look at. We'll go all the way down to question 7. Who is responsible for first aid? So we'll see if there has anything about first aid. So a lot of information, a lot of information, a lot of information. This is the man who made it. This is his position. This is when he did it. He did it with consulting with the principal. Communicate to everybody. First aid officer, Julie Mao. B. That easy. That is our first aid officer. According to the text, which of the following hazards was assessed as having the highest risk? Now, highest risk, quite interestingly, according to their scale, is actually a lower number. It is against what I would see as conventional, coming from a mining background, but I guess they can have different matrices with different rating systems, however they choose. And they are saying that something that is extreme risk is a 1 or a 2, while something low risk is a 5 or a 6, moderate in the middle. So a low number is actually worse. So we'll have to have a look at all these and see which one has the lowest number. Trips and falls has a 4. 4 for trips and falls. Shot hitting a person, that's the bottom one, that's also a 4. Sand in the eyes is a 5. And the only one we're missing is bar hitting the high jumper, which is a 3. So that was the lowest number. We had 3, 2 4s and a 5. So the one of having the highest risk, so the combination of likelihood and consequence, the one that was most pronounced was for the bar hitting the high jumper, which, just for the record, they called that a 3. So they said that it was likely to happen or unlikely, and it could either be a long-term injury or just have a few days off school or medical attention. So yeah, bar hitting high jumper was one that they saw as having the highest risk. Now if we look at the next question, Assume that the hazard sand in eyes requires only first aid. Which likelihood was selected in the risk assessment matrix to determine the overall risk assessment number for this hazard? Now, in case you can't remember what number sand in the eyes was, it was a 5, but we have a look. There it is. There's our risk of 5. Now, for it to be 5, and it is saying that it only required first aid, that means we have to go to first aid, not several days off school. First aid, and there's our 5. If it didn't mention that assumption of first aid, I guess we could make the assumption ourselves. Would getting sand in your eyes lead to medical attention and several days off, or first aid? It doesn't even want us to think of it like that. It just makes the assumption for us. So that is the way that you read that. First aid needed, and we just need to look for where the 5 is. And there it is. So it's saying that it is unlikely that sand will go in the eyes as a result of their activities from, I'm guessing, long jump. So because that is unlikely, answer C, unlikely is our answer. Which hazard requires control measures during but not prior to the event? So if we go to the top here, this is when we implement the control measures. And here's the words during and prior. So we just need to see whereabouts, which one only has a during. So students misbehaving, there's students misbehaving prior and during. That makes sense. At all points you want to make sure they don't misbehave. Boarding, disembarking the coach during. So that seems like that is the right answer. We'll just double check to see whether the others do not have prior in their name. Sand in eyes, trips and falls. Sand in eyes, prior and during. Trips and falls, prior and during. So, boarding and disembarking the coach is our correct answer. So those control measures are only during and not prior. Who is required to have prior experience for the high jump activity? So let's have a look at high jump activity. There's our high jump. So we've got to make sure you use straps. Only students with prior practice. So there we go. It has to be something that mentions students. But it also mentions supervising teacher must have experience and knowledge of safety rules for high jump. So it's saying students and teachers, doesn't make mention of coordinator. So we're led to assume and infer that they're only asking for C, students and teachers. So, next, shading is used in the risk assessment matrix to Is it to group the cells by level of risk, make it easier to follow the columns and rows, emphasize the number that represents low risk, make the presentation of the information more appealing? I'd say it's not B, because that would mean all the rows and all the columns are like different shades. Obviously there are different shades of cells within the same column or the same row, so it's not B. Emphasize the numbers that represent low risk. Now low risk is actually high numbers, so these are the lowest risk, 5 and 6, and they don't even have a colour, so I don't think it will be that one. Make the presentation of the information more appealing is arguable. I think it does look more appealing, having conditional formatting, having colour coding, or shading as they're calling it. But it's clear that what they're trying to do is group the cells by level of risk. Your extremes are very dark, your moderate risk, 3 and 4, is a bit lighter colour, and your 5 and 6, low risk. They just leave blank, leave white, no shading at all. So A is your answer there. Okay, now we are up to, we had just finished A, so down we go to question 13, where we need to look at some information. So it first makes mention of, below are 4 versions of a sentence about the policy. Just want to make sure I haven't missed any question. No, that's okay. So, below are 4 versions of a sentence about the policy. Which version has the best punctuation? Now, they all have exactly the same words, So to look at what is different, as teachers and parents have previously stated it is not acceptable. Too many commas there, unnecessary. As teachers and parents have previously stated it is not acceptable for new policies simply to be announced with no possibility of input. Yeah, that's not where I'd have a comma. As teachers and parents have previously stated, it is not acceptable for new policies simply to be announced with no possibility for input. Now C and D have the same thing, except for there's a semicolon or a colon at the end of stated. Now the rules for a semicolon are that they separate two independent clauses, and what that means is two different parts of a sentence. So, and for them to be independent, what it truly means for them to be independent is that they would be able to be used as standalone sentences. So if we were able to have a full stop here, would that first part be able to be a proper sentence? Would the second part be able to be a proper sentence? As teachers and parents have previously stated. Now that's not a proper sentence. That is clearly alluding to more information. So the answer of semicolon would be wrong. It has to be comma, it has to be option D. Because we need to have that slight pause from that first clause to have the joining clause afterwards. That is giving further information. If this first part was changed to something like, it is as teachers and parents had previously stated, or it is as teachers and parents had stated in the past, or it is just as parents and teachers had stated in the past. Something like that sounds like a sentence which you can then have a proper pause and then have a further sentence later with more information. It leaves it too open-ended. As soon as you hear that first part, you need to hear more. It's not, as they say, in a proper sentence when it comes to the English conventions. Now this question is tricky because the second part is a proper sentence. It can be a standalone sentence. It is not acceptable for new policies simply to be announced with no possibility for input. So this is where you need to have a working understanding of how to use a semicolon, and you need to perhaps practice, and I'll put a further video up about this in future, about looking when you use it, when you don't, and the judgment calls as to what constitutes a fully constructed and working sentence in the English language. Question 14. These are questions which you will have in your LANTITE. It's just looking at a sentence and writing the letter N if there's no error and correcting the error if there's something that's spelt wrong. It's hardly necessary to reiterate that this school has it should be an excellent record of supporting its students. Now, in the actual answer form on the LANTITE website for this question, they actually give incorrect information. It says that because excellence starts with a vowel, that you would need to put an in front of it. But that is not correct. That is partly correct, mostly correct, but it's not 100% correct. The correct reason to put an in front of a word is when the following word begins with a vowel sound. So the word hour, as in half an hour, you need an before hour, even though it starts with an H. If you had the word university, which starts with a vowel, you do not say a university. You do not say an university, you do say a university. I went to a university yesterday. This is based on whether it has a vowel sound or not. University, despite starting with a vowel, has a sound of the letter Y, U, as in you are, university. So in that instance, we would definitely have a before the consonant sound, which is what that word starts with. For the word hour, like I mentioned before, half an hour, hour, despite starting with a consonant, has a vowel sound. The H is silent, so it makes a O sound, an OU sound, ow, or an AO sound, ow. That, or even an OW, like in the word owl, like the animal. But it is definitely a vowel sound at the start of that word. So it's not got to do with whether the word starts with a vowel or a consonant. Generally, if you go by that rule, you'll get it right, but there are some exceptions. So that's why I want to give you the information to which there are no exceptions. If the word starts with a vowel sound, you need to have an in front of it. If it starts with a consonant sound, you have a in front of it. Think of how the word is pronounced, not how the word is spelt. So the answer for this is an. Question 15. The school's leadership group will determine who will conduct an investigation into the complaint. Does it go into, in which section do we put it in? Rationale, intentions, implementation, evaluation. So rationale is just a bit of an overview as to their complaints policy. Intentions is the point of it. Implementation is how they actually do it, and evaluation is about the review process. So about determining who will conduct the investigation, that is not evaluation. That is not reviewing what's going on. It's not their general message of what they're doing or their intent. It clearly has to do with the implementation. Implementation means putting your plans into practice. This is how they say that they do implementation. You make complaints to the school in writing, telephone, or person, or you speak to someone. The person who made the complaint will be informed as to what is going on. Now, I'm in my 30s. I have never seen that word before, apprised. So expect to see some new words, some obscure vocabulary in LANTITE. When I did the test, that's certainly what I saw. So I guess this is a good little practice question. They've got some good practice texts here for what you're going to do. They store your complaints, and then they try to minimize any adverse effects. And this actually fits well in that somebody from the school's leadership group will determine who will conduct the investigation into that complaint. So yes, definitely implementation. Even without reading this properly, just knowing what implementation means, which is obviously from the original word implement, will definitely push you in that direction. But just reading this and understanding what it's saying will help solidify your confidence in your response. 16. So again, spelling errors. Let's see if we can find any. Determining how to handle complaints can sometimes be quite a challenge, and I'm sure that everyone will appreciate clarity around this. If you're reasonably well read, you'll definitely know that that's not how we spell appreciate. It won't have the S, so it'll be A-P-P-R-E-C-I-A-T-E. There'll be no S. A word has been left out of the following sentence. Unfortunately, we have had less responses than we were expecting, fewer responses than we were expecting, smaller responses than we were expecting, or insufficient responses than we were expecting. Insufficient is no good. Smaller, it actually works, but it's unconventional. Now the answer is fewer. I guess it's because fewer is just a better fit when it comes to the flow of the sentence. It's something that there will be certain words that are just used more often in certain contexts, and this is one such example. Less responses is you could use less in some contexts, but it's just not the best fit. I will write down more about this because I feel that it's something that maybe writing down and having a quick read of a sentence or two is probably a bit better than listen to me go on about it. Now the last couple of questions before we stop this video, because I can't have it go too long. So questions 18. Does paragraph 1 emphasize similarities between the two ideas listed in each of the rows below? So I'll read paragraph 1. Tyson. This chapter will be a yarn rather than an essay because, and by the way, yarn, it's got a number 1 there. It talks about what it is, which I'm guessing is a story of some sort. Yarn means talk or chat. There it is. This chapter will be a yarn rather than an essay because this is a more appropriate and effective way for us to share and convey this knowledge. This is because the narrative and yarning modalities of our oral culture have been the keys to our thinking, learning, doing, knowing and being for many thousands of years. This Western Academy shouldn't have a problem with this written yarn genre as an emerging form of Indigenous academic expression. After all, their own higher learning traditions are grounded in the same thing. Plato and all those original Greek thinkers used to write their scholarly works as dialogues. If this kind of interface between oral and print modes is the foundation of Western thought, then as teachers and students we should engage with it, particularly in this age of information technology when the means of communication demand this kind of interaction once again. The fact that these Western dialogical forms, both new and ancient, are a good match with our Aboriginal yarning modalities, well, that's just a bonus. So, does it emphasise similarities between the two ideas, Indigenous and Western academic expression? Absolutely. It's made mention that they're very similar, and yeah, it's a bonus that they are. And essay and dialogue forms, again, absolutely. They're talking about how the Greek thinkers used to write their scholarly works as dialogues, and it makes mention that the combination of oral and print modes, so speaking and written forms, is the foundation of Western thought. So definitely, they're definitely making mention of that. Question 19. Again, one of the interesting questions. Which benefit of yarning does Melissa emphasise? Okay, here we go, paragraph 2. It can be said that we all yarn in some aspect at any given time. However, real and authentic yarning usually takes place with people whom you respect and trust. It's overwhelming how yarning is a transformation for oneself. Often, we hold these thoughts, processes and images in our head for days just to have that one important yarn. How is it that we can retain so much information? Looking at the 8-way diagram for this chapter below, the boomerang, the story sharing element, is a starting point for memory and for conversation in any shape or form. It works for us, and it works for our students whom we teach. So, does it emphasize understanding of fictional narratives? I wouldn't say it does. Does it improve verbal skills? No, it's not even alluding to that. Does it increase social standing? I wouldn't have thought so. No, it's not, I don't think, making much mention about how your social standing is in any way better as a result of yarns. Profound personal change. Now, I wouldn't say that it has much emphasis on this, but it does mention about a transformation for oneself. But to say that that is a profound personal change is a stretch, because you could say when a child hasn't had his medication that it's a transformation for oneself, or you could say that when somebody drinks alcohol it's a transformation for oneself. It's there's nothing in this that definitely says that it's a personal change, I guess, like as in just strictly to do with personality. It's just, to be honest, it's just a very strange way of wording things. So I would say D is slightly correct and the others aren't correct at all. So not a very clear answer here. If there was an E for none of the above, that's what I would lean more towards. But yeah, definitely doesn't make mention of fictional narratives, verbal skills. You can infer that. In social standing, not really. Personal change, very, very minorly. But that's the answer that they're looking for. Again, this is an example of picking what is most correct, which is D. And last one for this video. Which element from the 8-way framework best relates to the last paragraph of the text? Again, funny question, because the last paragraph of the text, at a basic level, You might incorporate the cultural concept of an Aboriginal sense of direction into both teaching and classroom management. Once your students understand directionality as a key part of Aboriginal place-based cultures, you have an Aboriginal perspective in play every time you ask them to look west towards the whiteboard or to line up at the south door. If you are teaching about crop rotation in Britain, it really does help just to be able to point out the direction of that island to the students so that they know they're learning about something real from a real place. So which element of the 8-way framework diagram best relates to that paragraph? So let's have a look at our drawing. And here are our options. Now, even without looking at our options from A to D, what it's clear to me is that the element from this that best relates out of all of them is learning maps, because you're learning about directions, cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, things like this. That is not an option. So, but when you look at learning maps, it's actually connected to non-verbal story sharing and land links. So if you look at these, land links and story sharing are our two main options. And clearly, because it's talking about land a little bit, whilst it's not talking about story sharing at all, land links is the answer. But again, this is one of those funny questions where you're picking what is most correct. Now, to my understanding of Indigenous culture, which isn't that profound, but land links is more to do with the links between the land and culture and people and spirituality. Cardinal directions has very, 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 very little to do with that. But again, we're talking about what is most correct. Nothing to do with symbol images, nothing with community links, nothing with story sharing, a very little bit of what I would have considered land links, but that's one of the ones that's connected to learning maps. That is the best answer out of the 4 we have there. So that's the end of part 1. Stay tuned for part 2.